Hi everyone, hope your break was wonderful. I am doing this a little bit differently, so I believe you'll be able to see my cursor and it will even get large. Yay. Um, so the respiratory system is what we'll go over today. I will obviously answer any questions on Thursday that you may have about this lecture, and I will have extensive office hours on Wednesday. I can post those on Canvas just to be able to go over this with you. So the goals and objectives of the respiratory system, I want you to be able to describe the anatomical divisions of the upper and lower respiratory system. We talked about the division of this in lab. The major features of the larynx and trachea. The histology, which means the transverse histology, primarily the epithelial tissue at the lumen of the respiratory tract. And these are simply the tubes that lead down from the nose to the lungs, the primary bronchi, the pulmonary bronchi, the lungs, and how they differ. And then finally identifying the primary muscles of respiration, their origins, insertions, actions, and the nervous innervation. All of those you've learned already. I'm just going to show you the basic muscles that are involved. So like I said, the respiratory tract goes from the nose right here through the ethmoid bone and the nasal concha, and as it does that, you get little circles with centrifugal force that forces all of the dust, pathogens, bacteria, viruses in the air out into the epithelial tissue, which at the nose is stratified squamous epithelial tissue with tons of mucus cells that are producing mucus. So all of these particulates in the air get caught in the mucus. Also, you have hair in your nose to catch this. So all of the structures in your nose are really to clean out the air. As you go down into the nasopharynx right here, the oropharynx, and then the laryngopharynx right above the larynx, you change the morphology of the epithelial tissue to less stratified and more columnar. Now, everything above the epiglottis is the upper respiratory tract. If you have an upper respiratory tract infection, it involves these structures here. The lower respiratory tract is everything below the epiglottis. So really the larynx itself, the trachea, the bronchi, and then into the lungs is the lower respiratory tract. And if you get a lower respiratory tract infection, it's named either laryngitis, tracheitis, bronchitis, or pneumonia. Unfortunately, it's not lungitis. But so pneumonia is an infection in the lungs. This is upper versus lower, which is completely anatomical. And the epiglottis, or the glottis, which the epiglottis covers, divides those two. A more physiological or functional separation is conducting airways versus respiratory airways. Conducting airways carry the air. That would include your nose, your pharynx, your larynx, your trachea, your bronchi, and then into the lungs. There are other structures that are conducting we'll talk about in a few minutes. But all of these, all they do is carry the air and they modify it, warming it to 98.6 degrees and humidifying it to 100% humidity. That contrasts with respiratory tubes, which are lined with what we call respiratory epithelium, which can be simple squamous or simple cuboidal, and they're the actual cells that perform the gas exchange that we call respiration. They take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide to the air. So in that vein, the functions of the respiratory system are respiratory exchange. To produce sound, we force air through our larynx, and then to regulate blood pH, and we do this by raising or lowering the levels of carbon dioxide in our blood. More carbon dioxide in our blood decreases the pH, making it more acidic. Now we have a couple of sections here, one a sagittal section showing the same figure I had on the last slide, and then here a coronal section that really shows the nasal concha and then the ethmoid bone here. And all of these small little circles spin the air and really get all of that particulate matter out of the air. These nares connect to the nasopharynx, which connects to the oropharynx here. That is the first anatomical part that is shared between the mouth and the nose. And then the laryngopharynx right here, which is shared between the digestive and respiratory systems, or the mouth and the nose. Air passes from the laryngopharynx into the larynx. This is another image from Philip that just shows all of the epithelial tissue associated with the respiratory tract. Starting in the nose, and you have sinuses up here, but then here's the nasopharynx moving down into the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx down here by what is the larynx right here. The larynx is formed of 3 unpaired cartilages and 3 pairs of paired cartilages. The unpaired cartilages are the thyroid cartilage, this massive thing right here which forms the Adam's apple, the cricoid cartilage at the base, at the inferior base of the larynx, that connects the thyroid cartilage down to the trachea, and then the epiglottis that we've already talked about, which is a flap of connective tissue that flaps down when you swallow food or water to prevent it from entering the larynx and then the trachea. The paired cartilages are more internal. You have the corniculate cartilages right here that sit on top of the arytenoid cartilages. Let's look at the vocal and vestibular ligaments. The vestibular ligaments connect from the trachea, or from the thyroid cartilage, back to the corniculate cartilage, and from the thyroid cartilage to the arytenoid cartilage, and the intrinsic muscles of the larynx modulate the position of the arytenoid and corniculate cartilages, pulling them back to make your voice higher, stretching these vocal ligaments, and relax them, deepening the voice. The other muscles that are involved in modulating your voice attach to the hyoid bone, and they are your suprahyoid and infrahyoid muscles that elevate or depress your hyoid bone, which elevates and depresses all of the cartilages and thus the larynx. Now on this next slide, we'll look at the cuneiform cartilages right here. You can see it right here, and it's deep to the thyroid cartilage, which is right here, and the epiglottis, but it's highly associated with these corniculate and arytenoid cartilages here. Going inferiorly, we have the cricoid cartilage. So as we move into the lower respiratory tract, the epithelium changes pretty dramatically. And what you have is, instead of the stratified squamous cells, you have pseudostratified columnar ciliated epithelial cells. You also have these large mucus cells called goblet cells, and this together forms something we call the mucociliary escalator. And we'll watch a short video on this. Here's the lungs moving into the trachea, and this shows the epithelial tissue, the large goblet cell here, and then these pseudostratified columnar ciliated epithelial cells. The goblet cell releases mucus, which falls down just by gravity. And bacteria and dust are trapped in this mucus. And the cilia then beat the mucus up toward the glottis, which then falls right back down into our esophagus, going to our stomach, which has a pH of 1. Bacteria and viruses are all digested and killed there. So looking at the entire trachea, it attaches to the larynx at the cricoid cartilage, surrounded by annular ligaments that are C's, not rings, and the dorsal surface is open. You can see that right here. And instead of cartilage, there's the trachealis muscle. which is smooth muscle innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system causes this muscle to relax, increasing the diameter of our trachea. That makes sense because if something stresses us out, a baboon jumps out of the tree, for example, we want to be able to breathe in as much air as possible, so our trachea is going to dilate. This is the esophagus, just dorsal or posterior to the trachea, laying up against this muscle. That's one reason that it wouldn't be adaptive for these annular ligaments to be rings, because then when we swallowed food, they would have to go bloop, 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 all the way down our trachea. So the things here are the annular ligaments, the trachealis muscle, and then remember the mucociliary escalator that is present all the way down the trachea and into the bronchi. We have two bronchi, a left and a right. The right is much larger in diameter and goes into the right lung, and the left goes into the left lung at an area called the hilum, and they enter the lung together with the pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein. Once into the lungs, you get some differentiation. On the right side, the lung is a bit shorter because of the liver, and in the left lung, the medial aspect is removed at the cardiac notch because the heart sits right here. We'll look at that on Philip in just a few minutes. The left lung, because the heart invades its space, only has two lobes, a superior lobe and an inferior lobe, whereas the right lung has three different lobes, the superior, inferior, and then a middle lobe that's more medial. The heart would sit right here. The atria of the heart are going to be right around here. As the bronchi enter the lung, they're called pulmonary bronchi. They first divide into lobar bronchi, which innervate each of the lobes, 3 on the right side, 2 on the left side. And then these innervate segments, which are portions of the lobes. You have 10 segments in the right and 8 or 9 in the left. You have fewer because you have fewer lobes, and the number differs per individual. All of these bronchioles, you can see a transverse section here. They're lined with epithelium that make the mucociliary escalator, as well as smooth muscle, and then connective tissue on the outside. Now, one thing about these smooth muscles, there is no sympathetic innervation into the lung. Parasympathetic innervation constricts the bronchial tubes inside the lung. Sympathetic innervation does not even go in there. So these muscles are relying on endocrine release of epinephrine as opposed to norepinephrine in order to dilate. This is why an anaphylactic reaction where the pulmonary bronchi start to close down is so dangerous. As you go a bit deeper, you reach finally the respiratory bronchioles. The respiratory bronchioles are very small bronchioles. We can see them right here and right here. But the difference here is the epithelial tissue turns into cuboidal, non-ciliated epithelium. No mucus production, and there's actually respiratory exchange going on here in the respiratory bronchioles. But your primary respiratory structures are the alveolar sacs. The alveolar sacs are blind ends to the respiratory system, and they're highly lined with capillary beds where the respiratory exchange occurs. There are elastic fibers present all around these that increase the tension in these alveoli. Now, there are 3 types of cells in the epithelial tissue of these alveoli. The first is alveolar type 1 cells. They're simple squamous cells, and they simply perform the respiratory exchange. Alveolar type 2 cells perform no respiratory exchange, but they secrete an oily phospholipid, which is amphipathic. That means part of it is hydrophobic and part of it is hydrophilic, just like all phospholipids. What this serves as is a surfactant. And what it does is it decreases the cohesion of all of the water molecules. The water molecules at this microscopic level really stick together, and they increase the surface tension and decrease the compliance of the alveoli, making it harder to stretch out these alveoli and making it harder to breathe in. So the alveolar type 2 cells increase the compliance of the alveoli, allowing you to breathe. The third type of cell is an alveolar macrophage, and you can see some represented right here. And these simply wander around the alveoli, chewing up and eating up all of the pathogens, or I should say the very few pathogens that make it through the mucociliary escalator. Now finally, let's look at some of the muscles involved in respiration. Obviously, the diaphragm is the primary muscle. The external and internal intercostals are antagonists to each other, with the externals being inspiratory and the internals being expiratory. The accessory muscles are the sternocleidomastoid, my favorite right here, the serratus anterior, which remember is deep to the scapula, the pectoralis minor, which attaches right here to this coracoid process, the scalenes, which you can see right here. I don't think those were on your muscles to know sheet, but they originate on the cervical vertebrae and insert on ribs 1 and 2. And then finally the rectus abdominis, which pull in the abdominal organs, pushing up the diaphragm and causing forced expiration. A couple of clinical terms to know. Eupnea is true breathing. Pnea means breathing. And hyperpnea is an elevated respiratory rate, typically caused by some sort of plasma acidosis. And then dyspnea is simply some dysfunction with respiration. It could be increased or decreased or just aberrant respiratory rate. Now here we are looking at Philip, and you can see the thoracic cage is covering the lungs and the heart. We're going to hide that. You can see the pleural membrane here. We're going to hide the parietal pleura of both lungs. We'll hide the visceral pleura, which doesn't show us too much more. But you can see the right lung right here has the superior, middle, and inferior lobes. We'll hide all three of these, and we'll see the lobar bronchi. Here's the middle lobe, the superior lobe, and the inferior lobe. Now you can see how the heart really fits into this cardiac notch that takes up space in both the superior lobe of the left lung. There's the superior lobar bronchi, and here's the inferior. Now let's hide the heart altogether. I just wanted to show you how that fit in there. And we can look at the trachea right here. Unfortunately, they don't have a model for the mucociliary escalator, but that fits in with the larynx right here at the cricoid cartilage. It's larger as you move posterior. You can really see the beginning of the esophagus right here. It's called the laryngopharynx. Let's hide that so that we can look at the tissue associated with the epiglottis right here, which goes down into the trachea. You have the thyroid cartilage right here. We can hide that, which is going to expose the arytenoid and corniculate cartilages. Unfortunately, Philip doesn't really have a model of the cuneiform cartilages. So here's the cricoid, and this is the ligament that attaches the cricoid to the trachea, or the cricotracheal ligament. As we saw in that one slide, here is all of the mucosa associated with the nose, and that's the cartilage associated with the nose.